Awesome. Well, while you all do that, we are going to go over just a couple of accessibility features for our Zoom call today. Just so you know, we do have the option to have live captions on. You can make those available if you like. Please also feel free to use the chat freely. You don't need to raise your hand to participate. We are a really small group, and so we are excited to talk with you all if you all have questions as they come up. We are going to be using the poll feature throughout our session today. So that'll just pop up on your screen. It's very easy to use. And we might even be doing some annotation. So you might see that little green pencil in the corner. That is an annotation function. And so when we get there, we will give you a little bit more directions on how we'll use it. But we're excited to see you all. And so, just a little bit about us. My name is Rachel Burley. I am a program director with the Ability Challenge. I am from Nashville, Tennessee, where I previously worked as a special education teacher. I started in high school, later became a dean of students and support services. I was the interim principal for a bit before I became the director of a special education charter network in Nashville. And I have been with the Ability Challenge for about 2 years now.
And my name is Krista Reed. I'm a program director with the Ability Challenge. Also, I live in Maryland, but I started my career as a special ed teacher in public and charter schools in Louisiana, and then became a lot like Rachel, a building and then a network level special ed leader. So thanks for being here.
Hi, Amber. So just a little bit about the Ability Challenge. Our work revolves around what we call the Thrive framework. And this is the framework that has the knowledge, the mindsets, and practices to build authentically inclusive schools for our students. And so our framework consists of 5 elements: culture of inclusion, student-centered curriculum and instruction, a shared understanding of special education, equitable systems and resource management, and meaningful family partnerships. And so, as we think through supporting our most diverse learners, these questions are ones that you can be asking your school staff or yourself when you reflect on your school about if you are truly inclusive. And so, just to name a few, does staff actually believe all students belong and follow up with their actions? Is teaching rigorous and accessible for all learners? Do staff know what IDEA requires and understand how disability impacts learning? Are people, time, and resources organized to meet diverse needs? And lastly, but most importantly, are families true partners in their child's learning? And so you might be thinking about some of those elements and think, hey, we're really strong in some, but maybe there's room to grow. That's part of the work we do too. So our work begins with assessment. So we take time to work with schools and districts to understand their current strengths, challenges, priorities. From there, we're able to provide targeted training, strengthen educator and leader knowledge and practice. We do specialized coaching to help teams move from learning to implementation, and also supply and create many practical tools and resources, some of which we'll get to share during our webinar today. So together, these supports help schools implement the Thrive framework, and our ultimate goal is to ensure that diverse learners do more than simply attend school, but they meaningfully access it. And so we're excited to share more with you today.
So we're curious about why you wanted to attend a chat about student behavior. This is a slide that I think summarizes why we want to talk about challenging student behavior. This is now a little old data, but I think more recent polling has revealed that it's even stronger evidence that managing student behavior is a top stressor for teachers. It's more stressful than the fact that we don't pay them enough. It is part of the reason why folks are leaving the classroom, right? Um, we know the workload is big. We know that teachers take work home. We know that in general, teacher salaries are not where they need to be to recognize the talents and the hard work that folks do. But when you ask teachers, why are you leaving the classroom or what stresses you out the most, it is overwhelmingly student behavior. I'm curious, I'm gonna pop a poll up to see this is obviously this is research and this is what we are hearing. I want to know if this is what you're also seeing in your context. So is managing challenging student behavior driving teacher stress and turnover in the schools that you work with the same way that it is here? Okay, we're getting some folks are answering the poll already. It's either yes, absolutely, it's a top source. Yeah, but it's not the top three and or not really. Okay, I'm gonna end the poll so we can all see the results. Yeah, 75% of us are saying absolutely it's a top source of teacher stress, right? And so if it's a top source of teacher stress, it's also probably a top source of administrator stress. Um, we know that folks who work in schools, this has only gotten worse post-pandemic. Like it was already stressful, it was already a top stressor, and it's only gotten worse, meaning that the behaviors themselves are more challenging and more students than ever are presenting with challenging behavior, right? Oops, I just skipped the wrong way. So, what gets in the way? Like why is it so challenging? Why does it feel so stressful? And we have a couple of theories. Number one, we lack a shared language in schools around behavior, right? When we ask teachers what's going on with Johnny in the classroom, five different staff members might describe that behavior five different ways and have five different ideas about what would be the best response to have, right? Someone might say he needs harsher punishment. Someone might say he needs easier work. There's all kinds of competing theories around the table around what should we do to help Johnny with his behavior. And sometimes that lack of shared language also means that that conversation turns to judgment quickly. Educators are stressed. Educators are working really hard, and it's hard not to take behavior personally. And so, judgment over curiosity in those problem solving conversations means that we're often closing off really viable solutions for kids before we can even get started on them, right? If we see behavior as defiance or a lack of caring about school, we're really unlikely to probably uncover the things that are really going to move the needle for Johnny. The polling information that we're pulling in here is that 80% of new teachers feel that they were not prepared to manage challenging behavior. And so when you've got a lot of new to teaching staff, or just within the first 5 years, folks look to the principal. Folks are looking to special ed leaders or teachers to be the behavior problem solvers because they do not have the knowledge, the skills, and the tools to effectively manage it or problem solve on their own. And so, even if it's a low level but chronic behavior, a lot of times that looks like a teacher saying, I don't know what to do. We should evaluate them. I don't know what to do. We should get them into an MTSS intervention, right? And maybe sometimes that's warranted, but maybe sometimes it's not. It could be solved if our teachers had more tools in their toolkit. And then finally, we're generally reactive to behavior. We spend a lot of energy de-escalating or responding to crisis rather than having the conditions in place to build preventative structures that help reduce the likelihood that behavior is going to occur before it starts.
And so that's why when we work with schools and districts, we really try to drive this point home that behavior is communication. Behavior serves a function. So, because behavior is communication, that means it's functional. It serves a purpose. It tells us something about the nature of the student's problem or potentially an unmet need. And so, when we think about behavior as a function, we're going to walk through those four functions together and give a few examples for you all as well. So, the first function we're going to talk about is escape. So, escape is when students engage in behavior that serves to remove them from demanding or unwanted tasks. So, an example of that would be when prompted to engage in group discussion, Jackson puts his head down and stays at his desk. Our next function is access, which is when students engage in behavior to gain access to desired items or preferred activities. All right. And so an example of that would be when the class moves to the carpet for story time, Alyssa remains at the iPad center and yells, cries, and scratches when adults attempt to redirect her to the carpet. All right. So her behavior is a function of her wanting access to her preferred items. The third function we'll talk about is attention. All right. And so attention means that students may engage in behavior because it allows them to access attention from others. And so you may know this from your own experience, but that attention can be positive or it can even be negative. So an example of that could be when Henry is given an independent work in math, he initiates conversations with peers instead of beginning his work. All right. So the behavior we see is him not doing his work. Why? Because he would rather participate in receiving attention from his peers. And finally, the last function we'll talk about today is automatic or sensory. And so this involves engaging in behavior that provides internal satisfaction or sensory input, which can be a way to self-soothe for a lot of students. And so an example of that might be when walking in the hallway, Mandy will hum and sing loudly while touching her ears. All right, so she's doing that self-soothing behavior. And so we have some good news and some bad news. First, the good news is that we have a lot of evidence about the function of behavior in aligned function-based interventions that show that they are simply more effective than just generic behavior plans that may or may not actually address the function. And so once those interventions are aligned to the function identified and normed across the school, teachers find them more easy to implement than some generic intervention schools might be using.
So, Rachel, the good news is if we can figure out a function, we can put more effective interventions in place for kids and they're not more cumbersome, right? It's not like we're saying, here, teacher, here's a function-based intervention and it's going to be more effective, but it's going to stress you out more. It's going to require a whole lot more work, right? They're not necessarily, when we ask teachers, right, in these studies, like, is it working better? Do you have better evidence that kids' behavior is changing? They're like, yeah. And we're like, is it really hard? And they're like, no, it's no harder than the thing I was trying to do before that wasn't working. So, more good news about that is not only if we can name the function, can we find more effective interventions, we can teach kids replacement behaviors that are more socially acceptable and that are going to serve them better long term, right? If kids keep using maladaptive behaviors that serve functions, they're not going to improve their behavior and it's not going to set them up for adult success. But if we can figure out what function the behavior serves, we can teach them an alternative, right? Instead of yelling or flipping the desk, we can teach you to, express your needs in a different, more pro-social way. So the behavior becomes less of the problem and less of what we're focusing on and more of a signal that we need to teach this kid another way to cope with a stressor, with their need for attention, with their need to escape a difficult task, right? That requires us to assume some things, right? That kids are not choosing to behave poorly or to fail, right? That they're using the best strategy that they have right now. They're using the tools that they've got. If they had a better tool, they'd use it. And so our job is to figure out what tool do they need and teach it to them. What skill do they need and teach it to them. So it's about skill building and figuring out those environmental changes that we can make to make a student more likely to use a pro-social problem solving skill rather than a maladaptive behavior that is not working for them long term. So that's all the good news. The bad news. The bad news is that too many kids that would benefit from a function informed intervention are not yet getting them. So if you've worked in schools for any amount of time, you may be familiar with this pyramid, right? RTI, MTSS sort of pyramid. The assumption is, right, that in a healthy functioning school with preventative, proactive supports, with effective core support for most students are going to be okay. They're going to benefit from that core instruction and those core supports that all students get. 80% of them are going to be fine. We'll have 15% of kids who will need some strategic support, but there will always be a number of students, hopefully no more than around 5%, who will need some intensive individualized support. Now, I don't know about you, but right now in schools, it does not feel like only 5% of kids need something more effective and more individualized. It feels like a lot more than if in a school of 500, right? It's feeling like a lot more than 25 kids. I've had a lot of teachers say, I've got 4 or 5 kids in my class right now that need an FBA or a BIP or something more intensive, right? Typically, when we think about behavior in this RTI pyramid, that top 5%, that's who we're talking about needing something like a functional behavior assessment and a behavior intervention plan, right? Who normally does those? In my experience, those are school psychologists, those are BCBAs. Occasionally, that's a special ed teacher, right, for a student with an IEP already. So, what does the other 15% of kids get, right? Or if your pyramid is feeling lopsided, it might be more than 15 plus 5, 20%. What are those kids getting? Are they getting the type of function aligned intervention that we were just talking about actually works? That's the question we have to ask ourselves. If more than 5% of our kids need something different, how are we going to get it to them when our schools are not resourced to provide that? How do we bring that support down to more kids without requiring them to be at the top 5% and, get to work intensively with the school psychologist or the BCBA? So, this is where we talk about bringing training and support to more folks in the building. We're going to share with you after the call a toolkit that has a protocol like this one that you'll see on the screen. This is our behavior function pattern recognition guide, right? If you have more than 5% of your kids that need a function-based intervention, they don't need a full-blown FBA and BIP, but they need something different and more effective. We need to enable our MTSS teams, grade level teams, to figure out what the function of their behavior is and to get them some kind of aligned support. So this tool in our toolkit is tool 6. It's like right smack dab in the middle of our toolkit, is one that we can give to teachers when they're in that collaborative problem solving mode around student behavior. And it can help them actually use the data that they have about their students to hypothesize what they think the function is. And then we have another tool that accompanies it and says, if this is the function, here are some things to try. Here are some interventions. Here are some proactive strategies. So we can train our staff on the functions of behavior and give them some tools so that they can do this work for more than the top 5% of kids in our school who might be getting what they need from a school psychologist already, right? If there are more than that, we need to bring that training to other folks. What that training allows schools to do is shift the conversation, right? Instead of hearing Johnny's misbehaving, what kind of consequence does he deserve? Or this is the third time it's happened. So now where do we go with the consequence ladder? The conversation becomes, what do we think he's communicating? Why does this keep happening? What's at the root of the behavior? Or instead of talking about, why won't my principal handle this? Why can't the school psychologist just give this kid an FBA and BIP, right? The teachers start asking a different set of questions. We start asking, what's our plan? And is it working? What have we tried with our toolkit? What is the data telling us? What might we try next? Rather than, is this consequence going to fix it? Which environmental change might fix it, might change the behavior, right? Look at how the pink questions are about traditional discipline and finding someone else to fix the kid or fix the problem. And the gray questions are about what can I do? What tools can we try to use differently to prevent and support the child so that the behavior is less likely to happen? Not what do we do after it already has. So when staff are trained, when we bring them some knowledge around functions of behavior, we get a shared language, right? Folks start coming to the table talking about behavior in terms of function, functional language, rather than, I think it's because he doesn't care, right? Which means the curiosity can outpace that judgment, right? We can stop thinking about all of these competing ideas about why Johnny behaves the way that he does, whether he cares or not about school. We can maintain a real solutions oriented posture that's grounded in curiosity and data. The collective fixes start to override principal handle it, school psychologists handle it, evaluate this kid for special education, right? Those are not our go-to strategies to get a kid help. The strategies exist within grade level teams. They exist within problem solving MTSS teams. And we can start to really focus on prevention rather than constantly being in a reactive mode because people are trying things and they're going to start working because they're going to be function aligned. So we just did a good news, bad news, good news, I think. The good news is we can change that. If you're on this call and you're an administrator, I think the other piece of good news is this also creates space for you to move from being a reactive leader that has to hold kind of all of the answers for staff to being someone who has the space to build systems, right? If you are not constantly called in to respond to crisis, if you're not the one having to lead problem solving meetings every single time, you can focus on creating the structures and the supports for your staff that they need to increase their internal capacity to talk about behavior productively. So, more good news from the leader standpoint. The other thing about this, we talked to a bunch of leaders in Orlando. Sarah and I were there talking to school principals and aspiring school leaders. And when we had this conversation with them, they were saying, being in that reactive stance means that they don't get to prioritize instructional leadership, right? They don't get to get into classrooms and give folks feedback on instruction because they're spending so much time in crisis management around behavior, having to work with parents and families to manage one crisis at a time rather than getting proactive support in place early. So, we just talked about one of the key moves for schools to make, which is to train more staff on the functions of behavior, right? This is not knowledge that needs to stay with just our school psychologists, just our BCBAs, maybe just our special ed staff. We can begin to communicate a common language around behavior, and that is the C in what we call our compass framework. So when we think about the 7 key moves that schools can make to build a more strengths-based, effective behavior system, the very first one is around training because we want schools to have a common language that allows people to problem solve effectively. We're going to talk about the rest of the elements of Compass next so that you can kind of understand why these are the 7 key moves. So C is communicating the common language. Train folks, introduce the idea of functions of behavior so that folks can start talking about behavior more productively. M, we're doing these a little out of order because they go together, C and M. We're going to communicate that language, but we're also going to model it, right? As leaders, as staff members who might be grade level team leaders, right? Like we are on the forefront of having to shift once folks are trained, we have to model that language. We have to shift it at every opportunity that we have, whether it's a formal or an informal space. So when you look at our behavior toolkit, you're going to see some tools for modeling and establishing that shared language around function-based understanding of behavior. I'm going to put another poll up for us because I'm just really curious about what you all are seeing. The question is whether staff at schools that you work in already use function-based language to describe challenging behavior. Like, is this something that you're hearing often? Are we talking about escape, attention, access? What's the last one, Rachel? Sensory, sensory. Okay, let me share the results. Okay, good news. You're hearing this in your schools. You're hearing folks talk about it. I wish I had put up another poll. I'm curious to hear, maybe we'll use the chat, right? Like, what do you often hear when it comes to function-based language? Is it that folks have a little bit of understanding and they might say, oh, he's attention seeking, and kind of that's where the buck stops? Or are they using that to like deeply problem solve and use data around function? Is it driving the interventions? I know I definitely heard people say, oh, I think he's, seeking attention. But I don't know if that always led to the data-based intervention selection that we're suggesting needs to happen after that.
Hi, Krista. In my personal teaching experience, which I've been out of the classroom for about 5 years, it was more like, oh, they're just trying to escape, or, we would like talk about the functions, but we really wouldn't use the data. But I wasn't a special ed teacher either, so I wasn't like data mind frame of that either. So
Yeah. Yeah. I'm going to go back to this, to showing this tool from the toolkit,
mhm.
because that's what I think is so powerful about it. This tool really forces us to look at the data in, I think, a very accessible, easy way. It's not cumbersome, right? If we have a little bit of observation data, we can do this. And it eliminates the like idea around you have an opinion about the function, right? Or you have maybe one personal anecdote to share about a time where it seemed like the student's behavior was attention seeking, right? This becomes a much more data-driven process. And it helps us then take that conversation around, well, why are we even talking about what we think the function is, to then match it to the aligned intervention? Because I think I agree with you, even in my role as special educator and as a special ed leader, I think people were generally vaguely familiar with the idea of functions of behavior, right? We've all definitely experienced a kid where in the moment, it felt like he's doing this to get my attention, right? So it's like not a foreign concept, but then the what do we do with that information often is where it falls apart. Beverly, I love that. I love your response. Being an administrator with a SPED background, like you are so well positioned to model that language with folks and making sure that they understand what is the point? What is the point of understanding function, right? That consistency of modeling is exactly what our staff need. Okay, let's talk a little bit more about the other parts of Compass, right? Organizing proactive strategies and planning systematic protocols. We're starting to shift mindsets and shift conversations with the first part. And now we're actually talking about building the systems that allow us to be proactive and preventative around behavior. So when we think about organizing proactive strategies, number one, we're conducting environmental scans. We are figuring out, again, using data, using observation, where are behaviors more likely to happen in our school, in our classroom, across the district, right? Where are the environments that we might need to think about redesigning for maybe some students, maybe all students? Maybe we have a lot of data that points to the cafeteria needs a redesign for everybody, right? There's too many behavioral incidents happening in this location. We should be going in there and doing a scan and seeing, why do we think there's so many fights in the cafeteria at the noon lunch shift? Secondly, identifying students with recurring patterns, not waiting for crisis. We're talking about proactively, universally screening kiddos, using historic data and using protocols to figure out who are the kids who are most likely going to need the intensive support. Let's not wait till they're at 12 behavioral incidences in the first month of school or 6 suspensions, right? That's crisis level. Everyone is probably pretty frustrated and going to be less likely to engage in a healthy problem solving conversation at that point because that behavior has escalated pretty out of control. We talked about this is related to that environmental scan, right? Establishing those structural routines that are reducing the triggers, the antecedents for behavior, right? If the hallway is chaotic and a mess and it is leading to, peer conflict, we need to come up with a more structured routine and redesign that environment. It's an antecedent for too many kids. And then this is the biggest one I think that I've experienced lately is we got to train staff on accessible instruction, right? If we're talking about escape from instruction, from classrooms, it might be that the instruction's not accessible to that student. The Venn diagram between students who are often needing instructional interventions or academic interventions and the students who need behavioral interventions, a lot of times is almost a circle. They overlap so much. Not all the time, but a lot of time. We're talking about the same students who are in tier 2 and tier 3 academic interventions and who also need tier 2 and tier 3 or more behavioral intervention. So figuring out what we might do to reduce the need to escape instruction because it's not accessible starts with training our staff, right? On UDL, on differentiation, on accessible physical environments, right? Thanks for that clap, Sarah. Yes, amen. These are two connected ideas, right? That's the whole thing about Thrive. These things are not unrelated. They are interdependent on each other. Beverly says creating plans between co-teachers in general ed helps. Absolutely. Oh my gosh. We are working with so many schools on co-planning right now and the instructional co-planning, but then also the how do we create consistent systems of support for behavior too between multiple teachers who work with the child, right? How do we create consistent routines, consistent expectations, consistent academic routines, 100%. And so the other side, P, planning systematic protocols, right? We should be using, this is related back to what we're saying about toolkit. We got to use those function-based response menus for the most common behaviors, right? If we think a student is doing X or we have multiple students doing X because the function of that behavior is attention, we probably need in that classroom some more opportunities for kids to get and receive positive attention at a systematic level rather than feeling like I got to go around, especially in the classrooms where I hear teachers say, I've got 3 kids on behavior plans. Well, when you got 3 or 4 kids whose behavior plans say they need frequent, attention from an adult, probably everybody does. Probably more than just those 3 kids need it. So we might need to think about a systematic way to give kids what they need that doesn't feel like we're playing whack-a-mole with multiple plans. Scheduling time for teams to problem solve together, again, relates to this idea of we're not waiting for crisis. If we're having grade level team meetings, if we're doing PLC and we're doing that in service to instruction, we need to find a way to also talk about behavior in some of those, either inside of those same structures or create parallel structures where teachers have opportunities to talk about it, collaborate, problem solve. Again, otherwise, this is going to happen on the heels of a discipline meeting simply with a principal. And then plan for vulnerable decision points. This is a term that we like to use around understanding when you and your team are most likely to do something or react in a way that is not in line with your values or your vision. So, when are we least likely to talk about the function of behavior with a student? When are we maybe more likely to jump to judgment over curiosity? Is it when that behavior is exhibited by a certain type of student? Is it when we're at a certain number of incidences? Is it a certain time of year or even a certain time of day? By the end of the day, we feel a time rush. We have to make a decision about this student. Are they getting a consequence or are they not? Are we having a family meeting at the end of the day or not? that time crunch creates vulnerability for us. We need to make a quick decision, which means we might not be making our best decision. And so a systematic protocol for that might be we actually don't make a decision around behavior after 3:30 p.m. unless the following criteria are met, right? Unless someone is in need of medical attention or somebody needs X, Y, or Z, so that we don't make vulnerable decisions. We don't put ourselves in a position to make hasty, poor decisions around behavior. And then finally, we're not going to dive too far into this with analyze, support, and showcase, but analyze data. Data should be at the heart of our behavioral decision making, just like it is for instruction, right? We don't make decisions about what to put kids, what kind of interventions to put kids in academically without screener data, without some diagnostic data. We shouldn't be doing it around behavior. Um, we also don't make decisions about whether kids need individual interventions or whether or not there needs to be a class-wide one for academics. We shouldn't do it for behavior either. Not everything is about individual behavior plans. Sometimes we need class-wide behavior plans or class-wide behavior changes. Showcase or support improvement is about giving folks the tools they need to do this well, right? We can't just train folks and say, okay, now go off and do it totally differently. We have to support them with protocols, with ongoing feedback and support. So we got to create systems. And then finally, showcasing success. We got to celebrate improvements in behavior. You know, it's not, Rome was not built in a day. We're not going to shift a 16-year-old's behavior overnight. And so we're going to have to find opportunities. Again, this is where data is important to find spots where there is improvement and where things have gotten better so that people can stay the course. Otherwise, it gets really demoralizing for everybody, for the kids and for the families and for the staff. Curious about the idea around supporting improvement, analyzing data. Is there dedicated time for your, okay, hold on. I was trying to do this poll. Am I still showing a poll? Is that why I can't do it? No? Okay. Let's try. I'm going to try to relaunch some polls. I want to know if there's dedicated time for teachers to talk about behavior data. It's not going to let me. You can just use the chat. I can't. Oh, there we go. Hold on. I got it. I think I got it. There it is. Is there dedicated time for teams to problem solve and systematically analyze data about behavior in the schools that you're working in? Or is that something that falls to a small elite team? Do we have the dedicated time and space for folks in a classroom or in schools? What are we saying? Overwhelmingly, no, not enough dedicated time. Look, and time is the one resource we can't create more of. So, like, we get it. And we saw the poll at the beginning of the call, right? This is the top stressor for teachers. If folks don't have time to problem solve, they feel really alone trying to problem solve for students, or they feel like there's only one pathway to support for a student, and that might be evaluation, or it has to get to crisis level to where that student is in the top 5% of the school to get the support that they need. Okay, here's where we're going to try to annotate. We'll see how this works. We have not tried this before on a call like this, but down, it should be down at the bottom left-hand corner of your screen. You should see a little green pencil, and if you click it, it'll pull up a little toolbar, and you'll have the option to use text, draw, or there's a stamp option. Mine looks like a little check mark, but you can choose what stamp you want to use. You can use an X, you can use a star, or you can use a heart. I want you to kind of think through all of these elements of compass and where your schools are. One being, this doesn't exist, to 4 is, we got this. We're strong. We do it all the time. It's really consistent. All All right, it's working. We're annotating. I see multiple people are able to do it. This is exciting. It's kind of fun to see a heat map of like where do folks feel like things are going well? What's a strength? What's a growth edge? And, and you can see each other's answers too, which I think is kind of fun. Nobody feels like a super big outlier. I know, when I think about the schools that I was working in and supporting, I actually feel like maybe our scores were a bit opposite of what people were saying. I think we tried to do a lot of the things that were further down on the COMPASS acronym. We did a lot of planning for systematic protocols. We tried to do a lot of data analysis and showcase the wins, right? Use the data to find quick wins and early wins on a kid's, behavior plan. But again, that was a really small team doing that work. That was me as the special ed leader with the dean, with the school psychologist. It wasn't something that we communicated more broadly across the whole school. And I wouldn't say that teachers could really take their knowledge around the functions of behavior and do that down at the grade level team level. It was reserved for a small MTSS problem solving group. And so we were real busy. We were the ones doing all the data collection, doing all of the plan creation for, I mean, goodness, definitely more than 5%. I mean, there were a lot of kids that we were observing and trying to come up with plans for. Rachel, I don't know if that mirrors your experience or not.
It does. I think looking back on my time as a school leader, especially a culture leader, in a high school building, I think we tried to communicate a common language, but we never defined that language. And so there were certain phrases people would use, and we thought we might have had a shared language around things, but I think if I could go back, that is one that I think would have really supported our team and our teachers.
Yeah, agreed. I also found every time that a teacher was introduced to, one of those top 5 kiddos' formal plans or evaluation, right? That's where you see that language used really formally around functions of behavior or replacement behavior, aligned intervention, right? We were having to teach that person kind of from the ground up. And so they're taking in a very cumbersome plan for a student and having to think through how am I going to do all the elements of this plan while also being introduced to this language for the first time. What does that really mean? And I wish that maybe that had been kind of more part of our common language earlier so that when someone does get a plan for a student, when they are sort of handed, here's the final FBA and BIP for Johnny, that cognitive load that we put on the teacher is a little bit reduced because they already understand these terms. They get why we're doing it. And now it's more of like, well, what do I need to do? All right. So, well, now I got to clear some annotations. Bear with me. Let me see if I can do this. Clear. There we go. Clear your drawings and clear my drawings. So now we don't have annotations everywhere. We did it. That was fun. And we figured out how to get them to go away. Top 3 difference makers. Like, what are the things that we have noticed the last couple of years are making the biggest difference for schools? Beverly, I agree with you. Something that needs to be addressed in beginning teacher training. If we're not getting it from, where folks are getting pre-service training from, we can make it part of our onboarding. We can make it part of our back to school conversations in PD. A lot of us are thinking about that right now. That is our first top difference maker. Staff having a shared language and understanding of functions of behavior. We're training them. If they're not coming to us trained, we're going to have to do it. Staff having dedicated time and tools for problem solving, right? We can't just give them time and say, okay, now go have a productive conversation. They need protocols. They need agendas. They need data tools to help them make use of the data and the information that they do have. They know their students, but they need to put that knowledge to use. And then finally, we haven't talked about this a lot, but our principals and behavior leaders still are going to hold a lot, especially around those vulnerable decision points in their schools. And those folks need a space for collaboration and problem solving as well. Some of the hardest conversations that I've ever had with principals are often around, I want this to be true in my school, and I'm having a really hard time making it happen under certain circumstances and scenarios with certain students, with certain adults in my building, with certain families. Um, Certain behaviors trigger me as an adult, right? And so I'm having a hard time doing what I know is ethically, morally feels right to me. I feel a tension and I need to talk to colleagues about that. So we need to give them the space to work through that as well. In the chat, I want to hear from you. Imagine it's November. All staff know what the functions of behavior are. What would be different in your building if that was true? Like, what would you see more of? What would you see less of? Working to find the root cause instead of addressing the symptoms. Yeah, I think we'd hear those more productive data-driven conversations earlier, for sure. Thanks, Amber. Stay here for another second in case folks are still typing. I don't think if you train staff, all of a sudden behavior is going to stop by all means, by any means. But I wonder whether or not we would see a small reduction because folks would on their own start to recognize some spaces in their classroom where they could address those functions a bit more proactively. They might recognize I have a couple of students I've already noticed. Maybe I suspect some of their behavior is driven by a need for attention. Maybe I have a bigger focus on a positive behavior system in my classroom where I am acknowledging students' positive behaviors, right? We've definitely seen that happen in a few schools that we worked with last year where they recognize we have an expectation, but we don't often recognize the students for who do follow that expectation. We spend a lot of our energy correcting the misbehavior rather than putting our energy into that more positive recognition. We would have more time for celebrations of students and families and more collaborative support for kids. Yeah. Yeah, when we can all kind of talk about behavior the same way, I think our collaboration is just that much stronger earlier. Thank you guys. So what we want you to leave with today is maybe a confirmation and an affirmation that when staff understand behavior as communication, shifts become possible. That's a real difference maker and a foundation that supports change in a lot of other directions. Teams are more effective when they can be responsive and proactive rather than reactive. And this compass framework gives us a practical map for what might need to come next for those growth edges. Like, we're good at this, we have this as a solid foundation. What could we focus on next as a school or as a district? Maybe we need to plan for those more systematic responses, or we need to do a better job of analyzing data, whatever it might be. And prevention outperforms reaction, right? From a leader standpoint, No one likes to be stuck in a reactive cycle. And that proactive approach protects staff, protects their mental health, their physical health, protects their, ability to return year over year, right? We see a difference in turnover when schools are able to focus on proactive approaches to behavior. It protects students and it protects instruction and instructional leadership. Thank you for being here with us today. Here's what you're going to get after the call. We're going to share our Compass one-pager tool. So the thing that we annotated on the screen, we're going to give you a PDF copy of that. We'll have the recording of today's call so that you can share that with other folks, the link to that. And we're going to share the behavior toolkit that we previewed with you because we think that that has a lot of great tools. So we'll share a link that you can, fill in information and then you'll get a downloadable copy of that. I'm going to share one last quick poll for us. I'm curious about like what this conversation today has made you think about in terms of the next step. Maybe it's I myself want to learn more about functions of behavior. Like I feel like I need to be more versed in that language. Maybe it's toolkit sounds like exactly what we need. We need more of the protocols and the tools. Maybe you're thinking, we got to talk about when we're going to make time for this training because that's a huge element that we don't have in place yet. Or maybe it's finding those opportunities. It says principals to collaborate, but it might be teachers and or principals. Okay. Oh, I'm glad folks are saying they're going to download the toolkit because we worked hard on that. We think this has the tools that you need to not train staff and then say, okay, figure figure it out. Here's our poll. Lots of folks saying they want to download the toolkit. And if you are thinking about training staff, when we are in touch after this, we will share some opportunities for ways that you might want to think about doing that. We've done this with schools. We've done this with folks who run after school programs. And we know it's a difference maker. So we are happy to be here to be a support to you as you think about like what next steps you're going to take this school year or whenever. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing the poll. We'll stay on if anyone has any questions or if anyone wants to just chat a little bit. We have about 5 minutes left. It was great to see you all. We really thank you for spending time with us. Thank you, Hope. Thank you, Amber. Thank you, Beverly. Who else am I missing? Some people had to hop already.